What's going on, everyone? Sorry for the delay in one of my formal tutorials. I've been doing a huge move, but I still wanted to make sure I was able to give you all something that will help you in your music production game. So I had a new song that just came out about a week ago, and I wanted to do a breakdown of how I put this record together. There's some really cool production tricks, especially if you're interested in making house music or finding unique ways to processing vocals and vocal chops. So let's not waste any more of your time and get right into it. So let me just go ahead and play the drop of the record so we get a little bit of a feel for what's going on here. Nice, hard, love it. So this really is a Stutter House track, and I love the genre. It's something that I started listening to, was kind of inspired by artists like Fred Again, S.G. Lewis, and definitely Keb's single that he had with the Chainsmokers and Ink. So I decided to kind of take my own hand at making it. Now, what I found is really 4 major components, and we're going to cover those today. One is really kind of setting a nice backdrop of house music, and that genre is very much dictated by the activity that's going on in the rhythm section. So to me, that's drums and the bass. So first off, the drum pattern is fairly simple. It's a 4/4, but when it comes to electronic music, especially house music, it's very sensitive to the samples and the tonality of the drums that you actually choose. So you really have to put your curator's mind on and choose the right sounds that blend with the genre correctly. So here's my drums in solo. Really nothing fancy is going on here. I have my kick drum. It's actually a little bit dragged. If you notice this space, the original sample is actually dragged out even more like that, and it started to make the record feel too loose. But I still like that feeling of that pocketed moment right there. So I have like almost, what would that be, a 30-second note behind the grid. The next part is then my clap over here. Very, again, simple. I'm barely processing anything going on here. I'm just kind of rolling off the low end. I'm really making my mix decisions based upon the samples that I'm choosing, so I don't have to do as much EQ and compression later down the line. And a really cool element to highlight within the drum groove is actually this little minimalist house music sample. So I went to a minimalist house pack from Kashmir. Love the Dharma stuff. Big fan. And I found this little loop right here. And it was actually a full extended loop, but what I did is I chopped it up quite a bit. Let me pull it up if I have it. Yeah, so here's actually the original loop right here. And what I do is I actually take little bits and pieces and cut it out and then throw it into my track. I didn't need all this kick and information going on. I just wanted that little perk right there. And that's a great way to be able to choose samples that really blend well with each other without having to find individual one-shots and try to piecemeal things and make like a little Frankenstein of a music production, right? Huge principle too, I'm really big on, is adding lift into the second half of your drop. And so what I like to do is I actually keep my first 16. That way the listener can get used to that new feeling of a drop, right? Because when you go from your pre and your verse into the drop of electronic music, there is going to be a big shift, and I don't want to offset the listener too much. But then once they've already heard it one time, it's time to kind of level up and graduate to a new feeling. And so then the second half is going to have the entrance of that offbeat hi-hat. And adds a lot of nice energy. Let's see, my group processing, kind of a unique chain over here. So I use the drum bus. Let me turn everything off. So the drum bus is a cool device to add some dynamics to it. I felt like my drums are a little bit smushed. And then I really pushed it super hard with the transient right here. Now, if you notice, so I kept my dry wet pretty low. So at 100, it made the drums sound a little more crunchy than what I wanted them to be. And I felt that 40% line was a nice blend. Okay, so here's a wild one and super non-traditional, but I was in a studio one day and my friend was kind of clowning on the other engineer and he asked him, hey, have you ever put guard particle on someone's vocals? And the engineer was about to reach for it and then he stopped and he's like, no, I'm just joking, that might ruin the mix. But I kind of took that to heart. I'm like, well, even though we say guard particle is for mastering, why can't I put it on individual instruments? So what I did is I just really loved the polish. I didn't want to limit the drums too much. I didn't want to add any kind of compression, even though this automatically already does with the middle knob. But what I did want is that kind of polish that you get when you use the God particle. So here's the drums without, and here's it with. Here it is without again, and here's it with. Absolutely super cool. And then my drum compression, a little bit of API to glue the drums. I'm very light touch, and I'm also using this in parallel. So my mix knob is actually well below 50%. And in order to get a little bit more of a pumpy rhythmic feeling, I'm doing a very slow attack and a very quick release. All right, let's go into the next element is my bass line over here. So the bass is actually 2 instances of Serum. Again, I'm not doing too many tricks in the mix phase. I'm mostly focused on what high quality sounds can I start my production with, so I don't have to mix as much, right? So here's the basses soloed. And it's 2 layers. My main layer over here is an instance of Serum. It's this organ preset, and honestly what I do is I literally just hit splice. I'll go to browse, I'll type in house bass and hit presets and just start scrolling through all the great presets that they have, right? There's obviously a joy that comes with making your sounds from scratch, but there's also a joy that comes from kind of being more of a curator than the exact creative, right? And I think sometimes it's a little bit too much to expect a producer or an artist to do every single component of a mix or a production. And so if you have tools where you can delegate, whether it's through AI or whether it's through Splice or sample packs, if you're delegating, then use it, because at the end of the day, us as producers, we're more so curators and directors than having to also always have to have our hands in every single component. So I pulled that preset. I love the sound of it. I added a dimension expander to give it some width, but not too much. Here's it on. And then I had a little bit of a layer of a sub over here. And this is actually the same exact bass preset, but I changed the octave. So rather than being -2 and 0, I actually made it -1 and +1. So now I have a really high pitched octave and then also a nice little sub situation going on too. And I just thought this would add some more dimension to the sound, because on its own, it's cool, but it's not covering all the frequencies that I want to be covered. Then when glued together, there's a fullness, and that extra little high octave is adding this pinch at the top end that is really pleasing to the ear, while also giving me this nice subs that I needed to support the bass. Now let's go to probably the most important part, because without my lead line, this would just be a house track, right? But with the lead line, then we are tilting our way into the genre of Stutter House. So check this out. So it was actually a vocal sample that one of my mentees found, and he sent it over to me, and he thought I could build a track out of it, and boy, did he nail it. Basically, here is the raw sample on its own. What I did is I actually started off with Ableton's Autopan to give it that pumping effect. So let me just do a totally brand new version of it. When you raise the amount, it's going to jump back and forth left to right. But if I change the phase, now we're going to create a tremolo effect or a pumping effect. Super cool. And then what I do is I change it to match a note value. So instead of being of hertz, I'm changing it to 16th notes. That's the rhythm of the track that I thought was appropriate. And then I wanted to cut harder, so I changed the shape, and you can notice as I change that shape, it starts to become a little bit boxier. Then one of my favorite plugins to just kind of sound design and make things sound more unique is AlterBoy. So simple. I just turned down the formant by -0.3. And then that's really it. Then I added some ambience using CLA vocals. These guys here are just to kind of carve the sound slightly, but really the main juice is coming from this tight reverb and the stereo effect. Check this out with just those guys on for us. Exactly. And then I'm going to go ahead and add my Valhalla reverb, a little bit more LFO just to make this sound more rhythmic. And then truthfully, the rest of these guys and plugins over here were to just make the sound glue itself better to the mix. But a really important one actually is the use of compression and distortion that I use, right? Because by adding these two effects, a pretty heavy amount, it actually pulled out the reverb and made this vocal sound a lot more ambient. Check this out. Then, as I mentioned before, I like making the second half of my drop feel like it has a sense of lift, right? And so what I did is I actually took these main vocals here, I duplicated that, and then I actually did a little bit of a bounce track in place, or freeze flatten as it used to be for Ableton. Boom, and look at that. We get our choppy little vocal sample. And what I did is, if you see here below, I took that sound and I pitched that guy up by a full octave. Check that out. Hard, right? And so now we have this first time going through. But then the second time through, we have that little octave layer to make that vocal chop come even more to life once it hits. And then also a really cool hidden plugin I'm starting to experiment with a lot more is this Waves Intelligent Dynamics. To me, it really behaves like OTT, where it's adding some heavy compression, but I have a lot more control over the frequency and the dynamic spectrum. So check this out with it's on. Here's it off. And so you kind of have a little bit of like some really heavy compression and a little bit of expansion going on at the same time. And I'm also tone shaping a little bit to kind of remove a little bit that low mid information and boost up the high. So check this out. So really those are the core elements between the drums, the bass, and reprocessing those vocal chops that make this into a Stutter House track. And really the biggest point here is focusing on choosing great sounds and samples from the get-go to minimize any drag to your music production and mixing process. Thank you so much, guys. If this video was helpful to you, I would strongly encourage you to like, comment, subscribe, and hit me with any other ideas that you want me to cover, or tools or tricks that you might need to help make ease into your music production process.